Thank you for taking time being with us today. Tell us a little bit more regarding your background and how did you get into real estate?
Yeah, the start of the journey was back in 2000. In 1988. I've practiced in the property tax arena for 28 years, but I went to Georgia Tech, Georgia Institute of Technology in Atlanta. Was a management major, and somehow I couldn't even explain it to you. I don't even know where it came from. Got very interested in real estate, and while I was actually in college, I actually went and got my real estate license to sell real estate in Georgia. Started out with a small firm, a brokerage firm in Atlanta, and that didn't last very long. So the end of the 80s and the early 90s were probably the worst time to be in U.S. real estate. It wound up being the perfect time to be in property tax, because obviously as declining values occur, people become properties are overassessed, they're paying too much property tax, and so they're very interested in talking to property tax consultants. So that was that was the start of it. And so 28 years later, property tax has been very good to me, and I enjoy the business immensely, working with clients all over the country, making sure they don't overpay their tax.
When I have one a question for you. When you take over a property, is there a way that you can challenge the existing property taxes, or you just stuck with the property it has to pay?
So you're definitely not stuck with the property tax you have, and so every situation is so different. It's a little hard, sort of broad sweeping to say. But in the U.S., what you find is that property taxes are assessed annually. And in many states, you can file a protest generally the year after your purchase. There are a few states where the year you purchase is critical, but typically you can challenge those assessments. So don't think about it like an income tax, where it's, you've got a sorted basis, and that becomes the value for the duration. You can absolutely file tax appeals on an annual basis. The complicating thing about the U.S. as it relates to property tax is it's 50 states. Everybody does it differently. And even individual taxing jurisdictions, the either counties or the townships, because up in the Northeast, you see a lot of township assessors. Everybody, even within a state, you see a fair number of differences.
And from our listeners, there, as you know, all our listeners are in Europe. So from our listener that would like to take over a multifamily property, can you run us through the taxes that an LLC, an entity that owns the property, will have to pay, given from the monthly income and eventually from the 5-year sale?
Yeah, so Diego, that's an income tax question that I'm not really prepared to answer. I'm not an income tax person. I know that in terms of ownership, you've got a number of interesting things being foreign buyers of U.S. real estate that you have to be on the lookout for, not the least of which is sort of the FIRPTA withholding rules that occur. There's definitely things that can be done on an entity structuring basis to help minimize the U.S. tax. It usually is somewhat driven by treaties between the countries. So, but income tax is not my core specialty. So I'm not sure I can answer that question for you. If it sounded like an income tax question.
Sure. So let's keep this in your ballpark. Where are your strengths regarding property taxes? Where our listeners could kind of more benefit more from the experience and the value that you bring to the table?
Yeah. So your earlier example started off with we're looking to buy an asset. So what our team does. So Ryan, my firm, Ryan LLC. Has a property tax practice that covers the entire United States and in Canada as well. But in the United States, the way we effectively do that is I have professionals in 29 offices who are local market experts. So what we do with our clients is we come alongside them through the entire life cycle of that asset. So from the very concept of buying a property, we help underwrite the taxes, because you're going to be in some states where there may be a property tax reset immediately or the year following the acquisition of the property. So making sure that the property taxes are underwritten properly upfront, critically important to preserve the yield that the buyer is expecting to receive in that purchase. Because particularly in multifamily, as you just described it, there's no other tenant. There are no tenants to pass through the property taxes to. And so that's a purely owner-borne expense. And so making sure you underwrite that appropriately is important. And then annually in the U.S., the process almost always follows this cycle. There's an assessment notice, which is the local assessor notifying you of your new value for the year. And then a determination has to be made about whether to appeal that assessment. That's where we come in. We are making an analysis of that property based on income approach, market approach, and in some cases, even the uniformity of the tax assessment between owners in a particular market to determine whether or not there's an appeal position. If there is an appeal position, then we jump in, go through that appeal process for our owners to reduce the assessment, which then reduces the property tax ultimately paid.
Based on your experience, where do you see new property owners commonly, some of the common mistakes that they do regarding taxes that you want our listeners to kind of know?
Yeah, so clearly, Diego, the biggest mistake that owners make is not underwriting the property taxes appropriately. They don't get assistance up front to deal with the specific purchase. So for instance, I'll give you an example. If a buyer is acquiring a property in Ohio, you have to be prepared that the local school board is actually going to file a tax appeal to have your value increased if you purchase it above the current assessment. So you actually have your battle is not with the tax assessor, your battle is actually with the school board, who is looking to have your value raised. And if you're not prepared for that, then you can experience a significant increase in your tax bill. And if you didn't underwrite it, the yield on that return is going to be damaged. So that's number one. That's the biggest mistake that people make, is not starting at the very onset of the acquisition. Not once it's closed. Before that, when you're underwriting the acquisition, you have to understand what's going to happen to the property tax.
But what does the school district has anything to do with the property that you just acquired? That doesn't make, from the first analysis, doesn't make any sense at all.
Yeah. So in the U.S., schools are funded via the property tax. And so what the courts in Ohio have given them the opportunity to do is so you get it now. That's exactly right. So so the local school board is getting revenue from that property tax. And if they think there's an opportunity to have the value increased so that they can receive more property tax, they're interested. Now, Ohio is a pretty unique example. But even in other states, by statute, the value can change. And so there's a couple of notable examples. California, South Carolina, Oklahoma, Michigan are all notable examples where your property tax assessment is going to reset after your acquisition. So that's why it's important in those states. And then in Ohio, and even some recently in Pennsylvania, you have to be aware that your battle may be with the school board who's trying to get your assessment increased.
And how do this, so let's say our listeners started to work with you, how would you advise them to start the process from, let's say, a good process from start to finish? And you know that always bumps in the road, but if you were to advise them to have a good, clean process in acquiring the property.
Yes. So we take on the acquisition side, my clients take this approach. Yeah, they take this approach is that when they're looking at a property for acquisition, they will contact us via telephone or email. They'll let us know the property that they're looking to acquire, and we'll do a very sort of high level impact study on what might happen to that tax basis, that property tax baseline. As they get further into due diligence, then what we're doing is we're actually preparing for them a report. I call them investment committee ready packages, that will outline a couple of scenarios. Maybe it's a best case, most probable case scenario on what's going to happen with the property taxes. And so the best time to start engaging in a conversation with my team is as you've identified a property that you are serious about making an offer on, and you're trying to sort of pencil what you think the NOI and the return on investment is going to be. Because if you miss the NOI, you got big problems.
Yeah, because if you buy wrong, you won't get it right afterwards.
That's right. So I would say that the second mistake that owners will make is not actively managing property tax on an annual basis. So the mistake I see some owners make, and I see this particularly with smaller owners, where they sort of approach property tax as though they were sort of a major repair. They're not really paying attention to a major roof repair, for instance, until there's a problem. I think about property tax it's an annual process, and you need to have a program around that annual process to make sure you don't miss something. Because the important thing, and I don't know much about how property tax works in throughout Europe as it relates to the assessment cycle. But here's such a critical thing for your listeners to understand is in the U.S., there is typically a single time to file your tax appeal for the entire year. Now, it may be a specific date, so it could be March the 1st in New York City, or an April the 1st in New Jersey, or a May the 31st in Texas. Sometimes it's driven based on when you get your notification of value. So it might be as few as 25 days and as many as 45 days after the notice. But if you're not ready and tracking for that date and you miss the deadline, then you have no remedy at all for a property tax reduction that year. You would have to wait an entire year, and that's a very costly mistake.
From the history of property taxes and to the future, how was it before? Do you see some good things happening now regarding we have Trump for president, and as you know, is big on real estate? And how do you see the future for this? Is it going good? Do you have some issues on the road? What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so I don't think that the new president, I don't think President Trump and the U.S. government is going to have a whole lot of impact on property tax for my clients. Property tax is still very much a local tax. It's towns, it's counties, it's school districts, and so I really don't see that the national political impact is going to be very large. More broadly around the country, again, because this is just a property tax on the asset's value, and it's the way local government is funded. So the federal government in the U.S. doesn't receive any property tax payments. You have states that receive sort of varying levels of property tax from the local. So in Georgia, for instance, the percentage of property tax that goes to the Georgia budget is very, very small, but in Texas and Florida is larger. So I don't think that the new presidency will have any impact on property tax, really. Most of it's just going to be local. Property tax is a very despised tax within the U.S. Because it's essentially a tax on net worth. It's a tax on real estate value, which, by the way, as you well know, is difficult because the value of a property varies from year to year. It's very subjective in terms of what the value of the property should be. And then on top of all that, it's a tax imposed without consideration for the ability to pay. So it makes it a very difficult tax. The local trends have typically been with assessors, particularly as the U.S. has come out of the recession, and we've been out of it for a while in the real estate market, is assessors are always behind the market. And so some of those assessors are still playing catch up. And so they're going to continue to increase assessments dramatically so this year we saw enormous increases in some markets in the U.S. I think that'll continue next year.
I'm a nerd regarding crunching numbers, and from my assessment, I think that the market is a little bit overpriced now. I see cap rates a little bit compressed, and the brokers that the quotes they are sending us, the property prices are a little bit on the high side. How do you see this correlated with current property taxes? And if they are playing catch up, do you think that they will? What do you think will happen in the near term?
That's so. Your question is a great question, and the concern is a very valid one. So what you have is always a situation where the local assessor is always behind the market, and when I say behind the market, they're always behind. So in an up market, they're always playing catch up. And if the market turns, so you're talking about cap rate compression and values at very peak levels. Well, when the market turns, the assessor will also be behind the market, which means that your listeners should be even more interested in making sure they have a firm like mine engaged. Because when the values turn and they start to decline, everybody's going to be focused on reducing operating expense, and the assessor will still be behind the market. So I've lived, my career spanned several different downturns from the early 90s in what the U.S. refers to as the RTC, the Resolution Trust Corporation days, where the savings and loans were going out of business and so much property was being foreclosed. There were dramatic reductions necessary in property tax values because the assessor was behind the market. And so your concern is on point, which is the assessor is going to have to be educated on the turn in the market when that happens. But for now, they're continuing to play catch up.
You're obviously very experienced in what you do. If you were to go back, tell us regarding some of the worst business mistakes that you did and what you wouldn't do for the future, what you learned from it.
Wow. I've never really thought much about that question because it's for 28 years, it's been a great business. I have been a part of the current practice that we have has been intact for about 20 years. So in many ways, Diego, it's sort of all I've ever known. But having practiced for 28 years, I think that to have done it over again, I think creating some better efficiencies around technology would be important. I think from a career standpoint, I've really only been with 3 practices, and they've all gone really well. Property tax was a great choice for me, particularly the time I got in the market. I think there are maybe times I wish I'd been an investor. So you know what? Now, if I talked about it long enough, now here's the mistake. Here's the mistake is that I had mentioned to you earlier in my career, I have been through several real estate boom and bust cycles. The biggest mistake is that I have seen property on the market that I knew could be bought for a very low price, and I never bought value low. I never bought. So if in the U.S. you saw a lot of in the big recession, property, particularly that had been bought for residential use to build single family homes where developments went bust and it got foreclosed on by the bank. If I had to do it over again in my 28-year career, I would have bought more real estate because I lived the market. I lived the market, and I knew when values were down, I would have bought more real estate in the down cycles. That's the biggest mistake.
And so also, I'm a bookworm. I read like a madman, so I always like to share books with our listeners. What have you been reading lately?
So most of what I'm reading is really just sort of the periodical type stuff, and so it's probably not a book that comes to mind in terms of something I've read lately. I think the next book that is on the top of my mind to read, and it will be. It's a pretty substantial book, is one called Execution, written by a former CEO, and now I'm just drawing a complete blank. But sometimes for me, execution is the key. It's Thomas Edison said, vision without execution is hallucination. And so execution is one of those things I like to get better at. And there's a recent book out by a former U.S. CEO that I think is probably the next book to tackle.
Shane, finally, where can our listeners get a hold of you if they have any further questions and like to learn more about your business?
Yeah, so there's a couple of ways. So my email address is shane.moncrief@ryan.com. So that's SHANE.MONCRIEF@ryan.com. And my telephone number in the U.S. is area code 404-942-6377.
Shane, it was wonderful having you with us today. Hope to speak with you soon.
That's great. I enjoyed that. Thanks. I'm glad to help. Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.